Hello, I'm Anastasia Kuzminykh, and this is a video presentation of work published at CHI 2020 that we've done with my colleagues at the University of Waterloo in Canada. And this work is focusing on how people anthropomorphize conversational agents and why this matters to us. The general-purpose voice assistants, such as Alexa, Google Assistant, or Siri, are becoming more and more popular, so more and more users are interacting with them on a daily basis. And these systems, in essence, rely on users' voice interactions with a persona, or an agent, who is deliberately designed to speak and act human-like. So because of this, voice assistants end up being integrated not only in the technological space of a user's life, the ecosystem of devices in their environment, but also in their social space with whom users communicate. And thus, these systems are often being anthropomorphized, which means that people start attributing lifelike qualities and traits to these agents. And anthropomorphization heavily defines the interaction style that people adopt with these systems, which affects users' expectations, their trust, and their overall satisfaction. And so far, research has actively explored the degree of anthropomorphization of voice agents. So whether it happens or not, do we see these systems as human-like or do we see them as machine-like? However, very little is yet known on what happens when anthropomorphization does occur. Are all the agents done the same? Well, intuitively, probably no. But if not, is their perception unique for every user, or can we find some underlying patterns there? And this is exactly what we wanted to explore in this study. What are the mechanisms of anthropomorphized perceptions of voice assistants? So what did we know about these mechanisms from before? First of all, mostly in robotics, people differentiate between designing agents' behaviors, such as emotional responsiveness, how warm they are in the interaction, their personality, and so on, and designing agents' physical or visual aspects, for example, their facial and body expressions. Say, Roomba vacuum has only behavioral traits, but wax sculptures would have only visual ones. And by design, voice assistants are capable of displaying mainly behavioral anthropomorphic aspects. But what personality and behavioral aspects actually matter to users? Is there any structure to them? And we hypothesized that if there is any structure, then these perceptions will be different and consistently different for different agents. We also hypothesized that the way people perceive the personality and behavior of an agent would affect how they visualize them. So how users think the agents would look like if they were humans. Especially since an agent's answer might include visual references, for example, Siri's "I'd blush if I could." So then, if there are consistent patterns in behavioral perceptions, we can also expect consistent differences in visualized perceptions. And in the rest of my presentation, I am going to talk about how we explored this hypothesis and what we found there. First, how? So what methods we used? We took 3 agents, Alexa, Google Home, and Siri, and we first asked participants to interact with them, because we wanted to allow for in situ comparisons of these agents, so that later we were able to tease out the differences as they seen by participants. The interaction session was followed by a semi-structured interview, where we asked participants what each of the agents would look like if they were humans, and what their definitive characteristics would be. In the next phase, a visualization exercise, participants were asked to create an approximate visual representation of Alexa, Google Assistant, and Siri. And here it was actually a tough methodological call. What to use as medium? Some standardized platform or free-form drawing. And eventually we decided to go with using predefined software. We used an open-source web avatar generator, and we did that because, first of all, we wanted to overcome potential resistance from participants to a hand-drawing exercise, and we also wanted to allow a better comparison between visualizations between participants, regardless of participants' drawing skills. And we concluded with a debriefing interview to capture some general notes and comments from participants about their experience. And let's first look at the descriptions of agents' character and behavioral specifics. And the main highlights here are that the perceptions of agents' character are indeed structured, and they are structured according to 5 categories: approachability of an agent, sentiment towards a user, their professionalism, intelligence, and individuality. And furthermore, they are indeed different for different agents. So each of these 5 major themes actually represents a comparative scale for an agent's character. And the first scale, the theme of approachability, reflects how emotionally distant or approachable an agent is. The distance end in the scale includes, for example, an agent being snarky or closed off, and it often would be in contrast to a user's willingness to engage in closer and warmer relationships. For example, very one-sided relationship, like they didn't want to talk to me, like here's your answer and go away. The approachable side of the scale reflects perceptions of an agent as emotionally warm, friendly, and willing to interact with the user. For example, being welcoming, feeling more like a friend, being outgoing, and chill. The second theme, an agent's perceived sentiment toward the user, is defined by a dichotomy from genuine to disingenuous agent's attitude. So how trustworthy and how focused they are on a user. And the genuine aspect here includes descriptions of an agent being benevolent, caring, altruistic, for example, coming from a good place, being patient, accommodating, thoughtful, or really trying to help you. Opposing these caring, benevolent perceptions, the disingenuous side here reflects assessment of an agent as cunning or indifferent or inconsiderate, for example, descriptions such as sly or disingenuous, or pretending, or about Siri using her sass as defense mechanism. Professionalism mostly refers to the agent's communication style as in work setting. For example, textbook assistant, no strings attached relationship. And there is no defined negative value here, but we did find that comparisons between agents often reflect the differences in the degree of professionalism. The intelligence of an agent was mainly discussed as a positive value. For example, descriptions like witty with knowledge, or well-read, or intelligent and sophisticated. But rarely there would be descriptions of agents' negative intelligence. For example, a little on a dumber side. The last thing, agent's individuality, refers to participants' perceptions of how much character an agent is displaying, and the specifics of this character. So this theme is represented by a dichotomy from neutral versus defined individuality. And the neutral aspect here includes descriptions that explicitly highlight the ordinaries of an agent character. For example, shy, not many interests, or it's just some random kid trying to blend in. The specifics of defined individuality would differ for each agent. For example, Alexa would have glowing personality, and Google would be warmer but nerdy chill. So the behavioral perceptions are both structured along these 5 dimensions and are different for different agents. But what about the visualized perceptions? So we analyzed both how people were verbally describing the appearances of the agents and the outcomes of the visualization exercise. The visualization exercise outcomes were first composed into collages, and we also composed the cumulative visualizations for each agent by overlaying avatars. And as you can see, the outcomes are quite illustrative on the differences between the agents. And in the descriptions and in the avatars, we have identified 5 main parameters that would differ. And let me give you some examples here. The build was mainly referring to the height. For example, Alexa is slightly taller because she's dancing. However, there was no consistent trend here. With age, though, there was a trend. Alexa is generally perceived to be older, while Siri is perceived to be younger. For example, Siri sounds younger, like late 20s, Alexa, I think, late 40s, Google sounds older, so between the two, mid-30s. The specifics of facial expression often reflect the perceived approachability of an agent. For example, slight smile because she is more playful. This is also reflected in the described differences in agents' facial expressions. For example, Google just seems stressed, they've got a lot of stuff, seems a little like their mind is somewhere else if you're having a conversation with them. Alexa is just maybe a little bit smiling, and Siri would be smiling a lot and has a lot of energy. The clothing style was heavily dependent on how defined was the personality of an agent for a particular participant. For Siri, such clothing descriptions revolved around daring personality with highlighted femininity. She would be wearing heels, miniskirts, crop tops, or, for example, I almost picture Siri in like a schoolgirl outfit, a pleated skirt, like any teenage rom-com. Google's clothes in this category are associated mainly with a stereotypically awkward persona. They could be wearing jeans and t-shirts, but it doesn't really fit them well. And Google would dress like glasses and the weird skirts and leotards. Alexa's clothes in this category often reflects her caring and cozy nature. For example, she would be wearing mom jeans and running shoes because that's a very mom thing, and glasses. So with that, we have identified the main themes along which both behavioral and visual perceptions of conversational agents are structured. But now we wanted to see what design elements affect each of those perceptions. And we identified 4 categories of the design features mentioned by our participants when they were explaining their perceptions. And the first category here was the category of provided information, which includes the amount of information and the level of details. For example, they give more information, so it seems like they care about you understanding what they're saying. It also includes the very fact of providing the information. For example, Siri is just cold, she copped out on a lot of answers, and that made her more distant. Second is the designed interaction style of an agent, such as responsiveness to prompts, prompting users back, for example, seems closed off because doesn't do any prompts back like how are you and stuff, and the tendency to use jokes. For example, when I asked what's her favorite color, she told me a joke, so yes, way more playful. The third category is agent's voice characteristics. For example, more enthusiastic, like there is more inflection in her voice, sounds a bit more fun. And finally, we included here the category of associations motivated by the perceptions of the company. For example, Alexa is more chill, maybe because a brand reminds me of books and stuff. And in the paper, we demonstrate how all these parameters have different impact on the different behavioral dimensions and visualized perceptions of the agent. So to conclude, in this study, we found that both anthropomorphized behavioral perceptions and visual conceptions of conversational agents first have some structure to them, second, have consistent differences between them, and third, are interconnected. And with that, I would like to thank you for listening and invite you to read the full paper for more details on this study. And if you have any questions, please do not hesitate to contact me using the email on this slide.